In 2026, where PC gaming is quickly becoming more and more unaffordable for the average gamer due to today's issues like DRAM production being diverted to AI, trying to save money in places to compensate for insane price increases that are occurring is becoming more and more important than ever. For a PC gamer trying to save money, some people may opt into buying cheaper PC gear like keyboards, headsets, and mice. And while there are some cheap peripherals that can actually be pretty good, when it comes to, say, a gaming mouse, your options can be pretty hit or miss. With that in mind, the question that this video will answer is, can you just simply upgrade your existing cheap mice instead of buying a more expensive one? Not only to play better, but also to avoid just purchasing a new one. The cheap gaming mouse that we will be upgrading is the Logitech G305 Lightspeed. It is a gaming mouse I bought for around $26. Being a wireless mouse that has a 1000 Hz polling rate, a 12,000 DPI sensor, and a fairly small and low profile form factor, for only paying $26 for it brand new, it's honestly a bargain. Using it in games is pretty solid and surprising for the cost, especially when you compare it to something like your average office mouse, and I think most people that have it will be perfectly happy using it. However, comparing this mouse to more expensive mice reveals its low cost. The first is its heavy weight. Being at 98 grams, it's extremely heavy by good gaming mice standards of today and makes using this mouse feel pretty sluggish to move around, and especially after using something lighter like a Razer Viper V2 Pro or even Logitech's very own Superlight 2, which are both around 60 grams. Sadly, it just makes using this heavy G305 feel way worse. Another issue is that these mice are sadly prone to the dreaded double click problem, and scroll wheel issues can also crop up, primarily due to random faulty mouse switches and scroll wheel encoders. More expensive mice have optical mouse switches and they typically do not have these problems. However, they can still suffer from faulty scroll wheel encoders though, like my Razer Viper V2 Pro, which was expensive when it released and had scrolling problems less than a year after owning the mouse. Now, what if I wanted a better mouse than the G305, but I didn't want to spend a lot of money to buy a new one? Can you upgrade your mouse instead? Well, let's find out. The first and easiest thing we can do to improve the mouse with its weight is just to use a AAA battery rather than a AA. I went with this lithium-ion rechargeable one, which was only $10 for a 4-pack, and it came with an extremely questionable charging cable and paired with a cheap AAA to AA adapter, which only costed me $2. Using our very trusty and definitely accurate Food Network scale, we can see that a Duracell AA weighs 22 grams, while the AAA lithium battery with an adapter only weighs 11. Putting it in the mouse means we have instantly shaved 11 grams off the 98 gram mouse. Despite not saving that much weight, it still does feel much lighter in the hands than it should, and it's already made it feel better to use. This sadly does come with a trade-off though, with a AAA battery only having about 33% of the capacity of a AA. So instead of 250 hours or so of battery life, you're now only looking at 80 hours, which I believe is a good trade-off since now it is a rechargeable battery, which means that you may also save some money in the long run. The next thing that we can do to improve this mouse quickly is to replace the mouse skates. If you have very worn out skates, you can just replace them with exact matching PTFE based skates. But I went with these glass dot skates that I was able to buy on AliExpress for around $10. And since they're made out of glass, they are not only smoother than PTFE skates, but also resisted scratches, which means they will last way longer. The only downside is they do not repel water and sweat like PTFE skates, so a mouse pad with some dampness or sweat may not work as well. I would also only recommend buying glass skates if you have a cloth mouse pad, as using a hard plastic or even glass pad may prove to be way too uncomfortable when using the mouse. Another product you can put on your mouse is our product, AimGrips. AimGrips are high-performance mouse grip pads that can help you with holding onto your mouse, as they are sweat-resistant and have a nice feeling texture, giving you more comfort and control over your mouse. You can go to our website, aimgrips.com, for more information. Okay, so we have now hit the point where we cannot improve the mouse better than what you see here without disassembling the mouse. So by being brave and undoing some screws, we have unlocked the ability to change out our mouse switches with more reliable and better feeling ones. The mouse switches that the G305 comes with are these Omron switches, which are extremely common among gaming mice around this price point. This one in particular is not very high performance, with only a 10 million click lifespan, as well as these being known for having double clicking issues. I wanted a mouse switch that would last way longer, so I ended up getting a small variety of new mouse switches to choose from. However, trying to swap mouse switches to test the difference would be super annoying as I am very bad at soldering and desoldering. Luckily, you can buy a replacement PCB board that has a hot swappable connector that the switches presses into, making this completely solder free. Now, there are a ton of mouse switches that you can buy, but I ended up testing 5 different mouse switches, being the Zippy DF3P1, the Kale GM 8.0, the Kale White Blade, the Huano Transparent Blue Shell with white dot, and finally the mouse switch that we ended up choosing, the Huano Transparent Blue Shell with green dot. We chose this one because we just like the mouse click travel and feel more than the rest, but do know that this is pretty subjective. What is not subjective, however, is that this mouse switch has a 70 million click lifespan and are gold plated, which should make them way more reliable than the Omron switches. If you buy a pair of mouse switches and a hot swappable board, it should come out to around $6. The next thing that we can tackle is the mouse wheel encoder. As I mentioned earlier in the video, I had a Razer Viper V2 Pro where the scroll wheel encoder stopped working very quickly. Well, as it turns out, the same encoder is also being used in this mouse, the gray Kale encoder with a black core. I immediately knew I had to replace it, so I'm going to swap it with the TTC Gold Dustproof encoder, which I have used before and is pretty reliable and feels very nice and tactile. However, this sadly means that I will have to desolder, and being terrible at this, it took forever. If you want to replace yours and you don't know how to desolder, I would highly recommend having this done with someone with some knowledge of what they are doing, as I really struggled with this. After finally taking off the scroll encoder, I can finally clean up the area and solder in the new encoder. One more thing I wanted to try before reassembling the mouse was this pretty neat aluminum replacement scroll I found. Although it kind of does resemble a top, I was hoping this would make the mouse feel a bit more premium, but it would not fit perfectly with the encoder and it just ended up looking crooked inside the mouse. So I ended up using the original one instead. At least it's still somewhat useful as a fun little top. So now we have a Logitech G305 that is slightly lighter, has smoother skates, better grip, and uses much more reliable mouse switches and a better scroll wheel encoder. And as it is a much better mouse to use than its original form, and I would highly recommend people to upgrade their mouse. However, it still does fall below what a more premium mouse should be at. At being 85 or so grams now, it's still simply too heavy. You can take off the battery cover to save another 7 grams, but that still is not good enough. However, there may be a solution that sadly will be out of the scope for some people watching, but this may make the mouse even better than most. You see, part of the reason for the heavy weight of the mouse isn't just the fact that it uses a AA battery. The actual shell of the mouse weighs quite a lot. The shell alone weighs nearly 54 grams. That means that over half the weight of this mouse is purely plastic alone. I think that we can do better. Ever since the rise of 3D printing, many people online have made 3D models of printable shells for all sorts of gaming mice to reduce the weight. And that is exactly what I am looking for. After browsing through different shells I could print, I decided on this one from user ZoroZirus on printables.com, which you can find in the description. I then tried to print an all-white shell to make it stand out from the G305 shell that we have. However, I ran into an issue printing the top part of the shell in white. After failing to print the top shell 3 different times, I just ended up switching the filament to a black roll, and I was finally able to print the top shell without it completely failing. I was actually shocked with how well the print turned out, especially since I was using a 0.4mm nozzle when a 0.2 would have been preferred. After some post-processing on the print, I was now ready to finally assemble the entire mouse. But first, I have to tear down the G305 again. While carelessly taking apart the mouse, I broke a wire that connects to the replacement PCB of the right mouse button. So sadly, I was not clear of having to use the soldering iron again. After fixing the wire, I can now start assembling the mouse in the new shell, which was surprising how well everything just lined up and how easy it was to put in the screws. When assembling the mouse, I would highly recommend using the guide, or you may not know what screws to use as there are different types. Sadly, everything stopped going smoothly when I got to installing the contacts for the battery when I realized that the top shell was actually damaged and had the part that holds the contact point broken right off. So I had to use my #1 enemy, the soldering iron, to melt the plastic onto the contact to keep it held in place. I also did the same for the other side, this time with the lithium-ion battery installed. Now this was really stupid to do since lithium batteries are flammable, so maybe don't try what you see here. Melting the plastic did hold it in for a bit, but obviously that did not last. So I ended up just taping the entire contact and battery down to the plastic, which seemed to have worked. Next was to install the side button and mouse button pieces. The side button piece I was using here was an older model, which I later switched out. Once I installed the buttons, it was time to assemble the mouse, when I realized I forgot the bottom power switch. When I finally assembled the mouse together, one thing I noticed was that it was not possible to plug in a USB to charge the battery. This was because I did not use the USB-C magnetic connector that the author of the build recommends. Since I did not have that, I simply used the soldering iron again to modify my shell slightly to allow a normal USB-C cable to fit and charge the battery. After that, I installed the glass dot skates from the previous shell onto the new mouse and ran into another problem. You see, the skates are not super tall and they're just a tad bit too short, and as a result, the power switch ends up being able to touch the mouse pad when using the mouse, so I had to trim down the power switch. I also took the time to replace the side mouse buttons with a newer version which uses a screw that you can adjust the height of, allowing for more fine control of how much you have to press the side button in. Now, I can finally put it all together and screw in the bottom screws. And we are done! The mouse is now complete, or what the author of the build calls the ZSF1, is awesome. After putting on some AimGrips to help with the 3D printed plastic being a bit too sleek, this mouse now weighs only 54 grams, which means the entire mouse now weighs nearly as much as the original plastic that it was encased in. That really does show you how an optimized 3D printed shell can make a huge difference in saving weight. This also now makes it slightly lighter than the much more expensive Razer Viper V2 Pro and Logitech Superlight V2. However, in order to really figure out which one is better, we now have to compare all three mice to get a good idea. The first thing to compare is the size, shape, and weight. And the thing that stands out with the modified G305 is that it is much smaller than the other two mice. So if you have larger hands, this will not be as comforting. I do think the mouse has a good shape, and I actually prefer the shape more than the Viper, but I do think the Superlight 2's shape is slightly better. The modified G305 weighs in at being 6 grams lighter than the other mice. Because of the mouse not only being lighter, but also just being a smaller size, I can move the mouse quicker and I have more control over it. Compared to the from factory shells that the other mice have, the 3D printed shell is not that high quality and is also not perfect in some areas. It does still provide pretty good agility and feel. Since we also added the improved scroll wheel encoder and mouse switches, it should go a long way into keeping this mouse great for a long time. Finally, let's talk about usability. This mouse has excellent performance, it feels smoother and is quicker to move around. I also like the mouse clicks more than the other mice, but you can compare for yourself as this is subjective. But this mouse does have some lacking features compared to the others. One of the things you might have noticed with the 3D printed shell is the lack of a place for a DPI switch on the G305. So changing DPI will now have to be done via Logitech software only. However, the Superlight 2 is also lacking a DPI switch, while the Viper is not. Another lacking feature is no higher polling rate than 1000 Hz, which both other mice can go up to 8000. The battery life is also slightly worse than the other two, but it's still pretty good at 80-ish hours of battery life at 1000 Hz. There's also no longer a place to store the USB dongle, so traveling with the mouse will require you to be more careful. So in conclusion, it was actually really fun to build this mouse. I've been using this for about a week now, and I really do love how it feels and plays. So should you upgrade your mouse with better components and even a 3D printed shell? As long as you have enough time, I would say it's definitely worth doing, even if you don't have a 3D printer. Just upgrading the mouse components with new switches, scroll wheel encoders, skates, our grip pads, and switching to a AAA battery made a great difference using the G305, and might even save you from wanting to buy a newer, more expensive mouse in the future. If you also have a 3D printer or know someone who can 3D print, I highly recommend trying out a 3D printed shell. It makes a huge difference, and it turned my G305 into something that can actually compete with more expensive mice. I hope you enjoyed, and remember to check out our product AimGrips in the description below.